with you because we're all very excited here at ABC. The big debate on September 12th on ABC, 10 candidates on the stage. Walk us through the stage, how that was done. What's your take on all of this?
It's an inflection point in the race because you have all of the candidates on one stage at one time for the first time. And right there, center stage, are the two polling frontrunners right now in recent polls, Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren. That's a bit of a change. Bernie Sanders has been fading a little bit, and Elizabeth Warren has been picking up. Of course, she'll be next to Kamala Harris. Interesting, Elizabeth Warren hasn't faced either Biden or Harris in either of the previous two debates. I'm also intrigued by the two Texans, given the news yesterday and given the shooting in El Paso a couple weeks ago, to have Beto O'Rourke and Julian Castro next to each other in a debate in Houston, I think raises some interesting issues and possibilities. And
do you view this as a serious transition point for the Democrats in this campaign?
Something we've heard from Democrats around the country is they feel like it's time to start winnowing things and to have fewer choices. And it's not that the other candidates couldn't potentially make another debate stage. They might. But I think for Democratic voters, this is a first opportunity to have everyone there side by side with some real contrasting visions for where they want to take the party in the country. And
Matt, as Rick mentioned, this is the first time you have the two presumptive front runners. You have Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren on the same stage. Is this the kind of debate that primary voters really need?
I think primary voters wanted a big open field to start, but I think most primary voters are now want this field more settled out. I think this is a key point in the race because we've now basically gone from half the field. We've halved the field from 20 plus candidates now down to 10. And within the next 2 months, it will be halved once again. We'll get to 5 or 6 candidates by Thanksgiving in the course of this. I think this is going to be an interesting strategy of what Biden and Warren do. I think the best thing they could do for themselves would be not to go after each other. I think conflict between them is not necessarily good for them right now. I think the ones who will be creating conflict are the ones that are outside the main center of the stage.
And Nazma, first of all, welcome to our roundtable. It's great to have you here. You've been closely covering the Warren campaign. What do you see as her strategy in this, because she's up there with Joe Biden?
Yeah, I mean, I think for her, there has been a desire to present a clear public policy contrast between herself and Joe Biden. And, you know, folks should know that Warren's long been a critic of Joe Biden. This predates her time even running in the presidential campaign. You can go back years. She was highly critical of Joe Biden's ties to the bankruptcy industry, to credit card companies. And so for her, this is really an opportunity to highlight where she is and how she's been calling for really, you know, it's her talking point, but big structural change, because she believes that Joe Biden represents a much more incremental approach to change in the party.
And do you expect others to go after her?
You know, I will be very curious to see how Senator Kamala Harris handles herself. I think that when we look at polling, we see that there's a lot of potential overlap between Elizabeth Warren supporters and Kamala Harris supporters. I would venture to say that Kamala Harris is aware of that potential overlap as well.
And that brings us to what happened in one of the last debates with Kamala Harris going after Joe Biden. And that strategy, she got a bump out of that, but it didn't really seem to work in the long run. What do you expect in terms of candidates going after one another?
Well, I know what people want. I've been talking to people in Ohio, and they really don't want Democrats to eat each other on the stage. They just want to know more about them at this point. It's very interesting that Andrew Yang is getting a lot of excitement. He's actually higher in the polls. He's like this outlier. He's 44, you know, the guy with the cap that said math. I mean, talk about like a new face. He's kind of offering the excitement that we saw on the Sanders campaign, and he's polling higher than Klobuchar and Booker. And so he would be someone to watch because there's still time for an outlier to kind of rise up.
And Rick, what do you think it is about Andrew Yang? Maybe beside the $1,000 promise.
Free money helps.
Free money does help, yeah.
I think there is something compelling about a guy that just seems to have played by the rules and done everything right and believes in math and believes in science and just is able to say, look, how can you be more different than Donald Trump, as he says, as an Asian guy who likes math? That I think there's a clarity to that I feel like is compelling to people. And in a sense, he's gone viral in a whole range of different communities where people start hearing about him and sharing. And I think there'll be more scrutiny on him as a result.
Well, let me just kind of say, I don't want to necessarily pour water on the Yang gang, but we're talking
but you're going to try.
But I'm not going to try. I'm going to reference the fact that he's at 2-point-something% in the polls. So the difference between him and Amy Klobuchar and him and Booker, there's nobody's in the double digits except for 3 candidates. And that's why this race, some people think there's 3 candidates plus 1 or 2 more. is Andrew Yang's doing well for himself, but he's at 2% in the polls.
But I'll tell you why it matters is because he's directly addressing the pain in the country. He's saying that truckers don't have jobs, that robots are taking jobs away. And I think the message that the
robot thing seemed to have resonated.
It did resonate because a lot of people don't know how to use the latest generation of an iPhone, and they're only like 60 years old. He's saying that basically, he's saying the middle class is hurting, and forget about a lot of talk about the 1% and the poor, but what about us? The average savings in a household in America is only $12,000. 1 year of college is many times more than that. And so they want someone like Yang or someone to say, help me. It's kind of a big moment for the Democrats to retake the middle class.
But the difference between him and Jay Inslee is 4 respondents in a poll.
I agree with that. I mean, right, to some degree, I do think that really what I am very curious is at the point when we eventually see some fragmentation in the party. Right now, Joe Biden benefits from an extremely fractured field. He has been extraordinarily resilient in poll after poll after poll. And when we even talk about Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, you know, both of them have struggled to gain support from kind of key constituencies in the Democratic Party, namely African Americans.
And Rick, to that point, can Warren overtake Biden if Bernie Sanders does not start fading out even more than he appears to be fading out?
I think there's a conventional wisdom that they take from the same voters. I don't know that it's necessarily the case. I think they're very similar ideologically. And I think, look, right now we're down to, as Matthew says, you could 4 or 5 candidates that put themselves in a top tier. I think the danger for either Bernie Sanders or Kamala Harris is, are you going to fade off of that? Does this become a one-on-one race at one point? I think Elizabeth Warren has put a lot of things together in the last couple of weeks that would suggest that she has a really good matchup. But you look at how she positions herself as a candidate of revolutionary change. There's a lot of Bernie Sanders in that. There's a lot of not Joe Biden in that. There is a pretty clean contrast.
And let's talk about those candidates who did not make the stage. We've got Tulsi Gabbard, Tom Steyer, Montana Governor Steve Bullock. Do they have a prayer going forward? What do they do when they don't make these debate stages?
Well, we all have prayer, so we all have, that's always an option. I think if you're not on the stage in Houston, the race is basically over for you, and you have to figure out a way how to get out of this race. And there's even people on the stage in Houston that basically have no path to victory in this. I think it's fascinating to me about the complaints from Tulsi Gabbard and the complaints from Tom Steyer in this, saying that somehow the process was rigged or that wasn't transparent. These qualifications have been in place for months. And if somebody like Andrew Yang can make the qualification or Amy Klobuchar can make the qualification, then if you can't make those qualifications of getting 2% in the polls, it's time you reconsider your race.
And speaking of that, Kirsten Gillibrand dropped out this week. She was on this program a couple of weeks ago, full of optimism. She seemed to be the voice of feminism. That was her campaign. Why did she fail?
You know, it's always the X factor, right? She just didn't break through. I think that there were many women. I think what's even more interesting is why Warren is breaking through. She's got a lot of young people joining her campaign. I think she had a consistent message. She was out there all the time. But in the end, there is kind of something about the believability. And that's why Joe Biden is still a big factor in this race. Because I
want to go back to Kirsten for a second, but Kirsten Gillibrand. But is it gender? I mean, you say that Elizabeth Warren got ahead, you know, Amy Klobuchar's on the stage. So really,
I think it was a lot of things. There were a lot of people that didn't like her. They just didn't like her. They didn't like her record. And so I'm not sure it's just a gender thing. I think it's a Kirsten thing.
And I want to talk about what we started this segment with, and that was Joe Biden this week and that gaffe, telling that war story where elements of it were true, but certainly it was a conflation of a lot of things that he has experienced. Do you think that harms him, or people just won't care?
I think that story in particular shows the best of Joe Biden and the worst of Joe Biden. It's him connecting and telling a really compelling story. It's also him sanding away the edges and conflating things and maybe confusing details. I don't know that any one of these makes a difference, but I think cumulatively it can actually matter. And it's really up to voters. And people have made the comparison, say President Trump with his misleading statements is on another scale. All of that is true.
But can he use that in a way, saying, look, he does it too, or, I mean, he'd never admit admit that he did it, probably does have it, probably, but can he use that against Joe Biden in a credible way?
Well, I would presume that Donald Trump will use it in some way to say this is a guy that is making things up all the time. But I think from Biden's perspective,
he would know.
Yes, right.
Donald Trump would know.
I think from Biden's perspective, though, and Biden's supporters, they could say, look, when the vice president does it, it is to make a point in a more artful way, perhaps, and to connect with people in a genuine way. When Donald Trump does it, it's often to demean and belittle.
You were out with voters in South Carolina.
Exactly.
I was in Pennsylvania, as you saw. I didn't feel it was resonating.
I don't think it resonated at all. And I should preface this by saying I was out with Joe Biden at Joe Biden events, so it's a slice of the electorate. But I specifically wanted to hear from people about this. And time after time I was told, well, I put my foot in my mouth. We all put our foot in our mouth. There's a sense that these qualities are almost endearing to voters. There's a sense that they find him more believable because he makes missteps every so often.
And what I'm hearing is that people just say, come on, let's focus on the big stuff.
Exactly.
It's the economy, and it's the character of the leader and the character of the country that we want going forward. And that's what they're saying. It's like, it's big time, it's big stuff that we care about. It's not about the stories.
I think that I agree with that, and I think the problem for Joe Biden is at some point, does it make an argument? It's not about the gaffe, it's about does he fit today? Does he fit the 21st century, the party where it is today, and is he the best candidate at the age he is in and the experience he has? Does he fit that? And I think it's up to him at the debates to decide that. But I'll say one other thing. Guns, I think, is what happened in Midland and Odessa in Texas, where, as you all know, I'm from, after what happened a month ago from El Paso. Guns, to me, is going to be a huge decisive factor in this election. Up and down the ballot, because I think when you have a democracy where 90% of the citizens say do something and nothing gets done, there's going to be incredible frustration when that happens.
Are you seeing that on the campaign trail?
I would say so, yeah. I mean, we began to see that, I think, even during the 2018 midterms, where we saw, the gun reform movement raise substantial amounts of money, I believe outspend the NRA in that cycle. And we hear it from voters, but in a Democratic primary, I'm sort of questioning to what degree that resonates, because you have all the Democrats more or less calling for the same reforms.
Mary, you're out there as well. Do you think people are really engaged at this point? I was very surprised with some voters, and I could go down lists, and a lot of people didn't really know.
No, but you know what? It's Labor Day weekend, and when the next debate is a really important moment, because it's kind of like back to school. Okay, we have to pay attention now. It's going to be this fall. It's 1 year out. Still a long time, but people have not really been paying attention to everything. I think what they are paying attention to, though, is money and the economy. And I think that's where everybody is going to be looking about, what is Trump doing that's good or bad? He promised to help the forgotten person. People in the Midwest still feel forgotten. And so I think he has a track record, and so Democrats have to kind of point to all the things that he promised, especially for these forgotten people.
And Rick, I want to quickly turn to you about Georgia. Georgia's Republican Senator Johnny Isakson announced his retirement this week, meaning both Georgia Senate seats are in play in 2020. Do Democrats have a shot at either of those?
Well, this potentially opens up the map for them, but I think there's some numbers here that are important. We know that Stacey Abrams came close, 55,000 votes away from becoming governor of Georgia a year ago. But President Trump carried that state by some 200,000 votes, won by about 5 points. So it's different in a presidential year. And as we know now, Stacey Abrams, their dream candidate, is now taking a pass on that race. She's not going to run. It's difficult. I think it says something, though, about the Democratic Party. If they're able to be competitive in a state like Georgia at the presidential and the Senate level, that's the path for the Democrats going forward. That is a growing segment of the party. And I think Georgia is a huge opportunity for them now.
And all eyes on Georgia. Thanks to all of you for joining us on this Labor Day weekend. Enjoy the rest of it. Up next, as economic concerns grow over the president's trade policies, a key Republican senator openly questions Trump, and the president has taken notice. My report from Pennsylvania on the impact of the trade war, plus Senator Pat Toomey joins us live next. We're back in just 60 seconds. on billions in Chinese imports. It's expected to have a greater impact on U.S. consumers purchasing everyday items like clothes, technology, sporting goods, even certain kinds of meat, milk, and other dairy products. The trade war has contributed to recession fears and volatility on Wall Street. But how will it affect the 2020 election? Will Trump supporters stand by the president despite the squeeze on their bottom line? We traveled to a key battleground state to find out. Our journey began in Allentown, Pennsylvania, where consumers will soon feel the pinch of Trump's tariffs.
We're going to have to be sensitive to it.
Greg Baldwin is the VP of merchandising at this sporting goods store. He's already bracing for the fallout and the sticker shock.
The consumer will either have to trade down, or actually we'll see bigger dollars spent, or they'll forego the T-shirt or the cap or that other item that they might purchase with it. They'll have to make choices. There will be compromises.
But the consumer
will absorb it.
Baldwin did not vote for Trump, but he's closely watching the president's handling of the economy. What do you think he's done for the economy, if anything? I mean, what can you give him credit for?
Actually, I'll give him credit for taking a tough stance on China and trying to level the playing field because it is unfair. Unfortunately, there's going to be some pain in this process.
Just down the road, we heard a similar story from business owner Chris Schmidt.
If a shoe was costing $129 and now it's going to go to $149, that's a huge jump.
But are average consumers worried about the price hike? We caught up with some shoppers and voters over at the Allentown Fair, where we found good old-fashioned fun.
Toss them in, win them out right here.
Memorable music performances, even for the generation that isn't exactly from the Woodstock years, and a microcosm of America. Can I ask you first who you voted for in 2016?
Donald Trump.
And would you vote for him again?
Yes.
Kathy Weidman, a lifelong Republican, believes the economy is right on track and is solidly behind Trump.
I like Trump because he's the non-politician that doesn't spew what people want to hear. You know what I mean?
Not everyone we met shared her opinion.
She's a Democrat, I'm a Republican.
This Republican told me he will not be voting for the party's likely nominee.
I don't like the man. I'm a Republican, but I don't like him.
Do you worry about the economy right now?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it looks good, but underneath it all, it's not as good as they're trying to say it is.
Pennsylvania delivered for Obama in 2012, but went for Trump in 2016, making it a crucial state for the president and for those 20 Democrats still in the race. Are any candidates standing out to you? How about Joe Biden?
Joe Biden? Yeah, if he's going to be the candidate and it's Joe Biden or Donald Trump, I'm going to vote for Joe Biden.
I don't know who's running, so if anything, I'll go for anybody else other than Trump.
Leaving the fairgrounds, we traveled north, trading this blue county for a red one. Luzerne County is arguably the county that gave Donald Trump Pennsylvania in 2016, even though they hadn't voted for a Republican here since 1988. Trump's trade policies and the vote from farmers could determine whether or not it stays that way. Over the past year, bankruptcy filings among farmers nationwide were up 13%, in part because of the second year of retaliatory tariffs on many U.S. agricultural products.
This particular farm has been in the family since the 1930s, and we've been farming in this valley since the 1850s.
Curtis Frederick voted for Trump in the 2016 primary, but not in the general election. He explained some of the difficulties that farmers are facing.
It makes it more challenging to come up with a marketing plan to plan your future sales of grain. If the market is highly volatile, it makes you be more emotional in your choices, so that can be difficult.
What are your concerns?
My concerns are that it doesn't get figured out.
And for now, there is no end in sight. And so joining me now is the Republican senator from Pennsylvania, Pat Toomey. Good morning, Senator Toomey.
Good morning, Martha.
You know, you've been one of the most outspoken Republican critics of the president's tariff tactics. How concerned are you that these new tariffs will further disrupt both the U.S. and the global economy?
Well, unfortunately, we're starting from a very strong economy right now. You know, record low unemployment, accelerating wage gains. We've got a great economy, but I do think that the uncertainty caused by a volatile tariff situation and this developing trade war could jeopardize that strength and that growth, and that is, I think that's a legitimate concern. And it's, by the way, it goes beyond China, right? I mean, you know, we saw last spring the president threatened to, you know, one morning woke up and threatened to impose big new tariffs on everything coming out of Mexico unless they cooperated sufficiently on an unrelated issue. That's a country we have a free trade agreement with. So the uncertainty that we have, the added costs from tariffs, I think they're a threat to growth.
You know, the president has repeatedly asserted China is paying for the tariffs, not American consumers. Would you say he is misleading the public?
Well, it's mixed, right? I mean, the Chinese currency has weakened, and to the extent that the currency is devalued, that does mitigate against the increased cost of the tariffs because it just makes Chinese products cheaper to buy. But I would underscore there's an important part that sometimes gets left out of that, and that is that China is an important part of the U.S. supply chain. Many manufacturers buy components and supplies and materials from China. And while the devaluation of the Chinese currency can offset part or even all of the tariff cost for that manufacturer, if the manufacturer is competing with a European company or someone from some other country in the world that doesn't have tariffs, they're buying those components at the lower cost because of the devaluation as well, and they're not absorbing the cost of a higher tariff. So it still puts American business at a competitive disadvantage.
You know, you probably saw there, I spent a couple of days in your state, including right there in Allentown, and while some are very worried about the tariffs, others say it's a temporary pain, and they support the president's plan. Why would you argue, what would you argue with them about it not being temporary?
Well, I hope it is temporary, and I give the president credit for challenging China on some of its really egregious behavior. The theft of intellectual property and coercive technology transfers, that is unacceptable behavior. I would have preferred a different set of tactics, but the president deserves credit for challenging China. My hope is that that's what his focus is, not just the fact that Chinese clothing and shoes are popular among consumers. That's not the problem. The problem is this abuse and threat of ongoing theft of intellectual property. If we get the Chinese to change their behavior in a meaningful way in that area and then drop the tariffs, then we will have ended up in a better place. That's what I'm hoping for, but let's be honest. In the meantime, we're doing damage. It's a double-edged sword.
And the president, you brought up Mexico. The president has used a similar strategy before. He says his tariff threats on Mexico got them to help flow the stem of migrants. So has the president ramping up the pressure, in effect, succeeded in some way to bring China back?
I think it's unclear, right? I mean, what we've seen so far is retaliatory tariffs. We haven't seen a change in Chinese behavior. It looked for a moment there some months ago like we were close to a really significant deal. The Chinese seem to have walked away. So I don't think we'll know until we actually have an agreement.
And Senator, I want to turn to gun control with last night's terrible mass shooting. You've sponsored a bill to expand background checks on gun sales to online purchases and to gun shows. You've expressed some optimism that this may pass. Do you think you have President Trump's backing and other Republicans?
Well, I will tell you, I have spoken with the president repeatedly and recently about this topic. He is very interested in doing something meaningful. He hasn't endorsed a specific bill. I think that would be premature, but he and I have an ongoing conversation about this. I know other interested senators are participating in that conversation, and our staffs including the White House staff, are very seriously pursuing this. Martha, I can't guarantee an outcome. I'm not sure where this all ends, but the president is very interested. I remain very interested in measures that would make it harder for people who shouldn't have guns to get guns. And, we're gonna take a very serious run at it.
Thank you very much, Senator Toomey, for your thoughtful response. We appreciate it. And we'll be right back.
ABC News honored winner of 4 Edward R. Murrow Award.
Crashed on the beach. No survivors.
She's not a scratch on her.
With Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you.
Next on Up Close.
Treat yourself to better sleep.
Young boys succumbing to hate.
She has, like many of her fellow first-term members of Congress, taken Washington by storm. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the youngest congresswoman ever elected, but she's not biding her time. Nor has she been shy about fighting the status quo. She's been pushing. What is she really trying to accomplish? And why does she say critics underestimate her? At their own peril. And good morning, everyone. Welcome to Up Close. I'm Bill Ritter. It's a special edition of Up Close because she's been called a radical, a socialist. And whether you agree or disagree with her, this interview you are about to watch is thought-provoking. With her ideas, her passion, her humor, and with her knack for social media, more than 5 million Twitter followers and more than 1 million on Facebook, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez knows how to get attention. She typically favors national news shows, but for the first time since her election, she sat down with us, a local television station, for a wide-ranging interview, and she pulled no punches, sharing her views of the country, the world, and the political future. Political reporter Dave Evans sat down with her in early August, shortly after the gun massacres in El Paso and Dayton.
So they'll say.
You look at your bio. When you left college, you came back and worked an 18-hour shift to try to help out your mom. You read your bio and your background. That's the American dream. I mean, you have a really honorable background.
Thank you.
Yet people look at you and they see the devil.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the media environment that we're dealing with. And by that, I mean not just sometimes the coverage that comes out of Fox News, but also the social media environment that we operate in, is that so much of it is incentivized towards conflict and to exaggeration and to caricature that it is sometimes funny that when I meet people in person, they say, oh, wow, you're a lot nicer than they say you are.
But Lindsey Graham, he called you a communist.
Yeah, no, he did. And it's unfortunate that level of vitriol is almost governing our politics, and that level of distortion is governing our politics. I mean, it doesn't... I don't feel hurt by someone like Lindsey Graham using that language. What I think I do feel hurt by is how it's getting perpetuated in our culture. I feel hurt when I see young boys succumbing to hate. That, I think, is hurtful more than any personal attack.
You think our president has added to that?
I do. I think he has. I think his continued focus on personally attacking people is unhelpful. I think it adds to really just a buildup, this fever pitch in our politics that is just not sustainable. It's not sustainable.
You've even said, let's stop asking the question if he's a racist.
Yeah.
You say he is.
I don't think that it's even a question. He's using the direct language and terms of white supremacists. He was convicted as far back as the 70s of discrimination in his housing complexes. He came out on a full-page ad for the Central Park Five, sending innocent boys to jail. His language launching his presidential campaign, calling Mexicans rapists. You know, it's not a question.
Yet you're not afraid of being called a radical. I saw in 60 Minutes in your interview, you talked about Lincoln, you talked about FDR, that those people were radicals. Radical is not a bad word, you don't think?
I don't think radical is a bad word. Radical
Is being a socialist a bad word?
I mean, I don't think so. I think ultimately it all comes back down to the things, the policies that we're actively promoting. And if the right wants to feather and tar me because I believe that health care should be a right in the United States, then they can go ahead and do that. But when we cross the line into racism, into targeting, into violent attacks, into misogyny, that is not even about political ideology. That is just about hatred.
Can we talk about El Paso for a second? I wanted to ask you specifically, the shooter, as you saw, and I think it was Saturday afternoon or Saturday night when we saw it, and it said something along the lines of, I want to kill as many Hispanics as possible. What'd you feel?